Class is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining today's webinar. We will get started on time in 4 minutes. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar entitled Nitrogen Use Efficiency, Understanding End Movement, Timing, and Rate. My name is Anna Goodjohnsdottir, and I'm the project coordinator at the Partnership for Ag Resource Management, who is hosting the webinar this morning. We are joined today by my colleague, Mark Adelsperger, Resource Management Specialist for the Partnership for Ag Resource Management, who will provide a brief introduction. I'm also pleased to welcome our guest speakers. Today we'll hear from Dr. Emerson Nafziger, extension agronomist and professor of crop sciences at the University of Illinois, and Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins, field specialist in agronomic systems with Ohio State University Extension. At the end of each of their presentations, we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A. So before we begin, I want to share some brief logistics. You will remain muted as an audience member during the presentations, but please make use of the question box on your screen to type questions for Emerson and Elizabeth during their presentations. I will moderate the questions at the end of each presentation, which is different from our last format. This webinar is being recorded and will be available later on partnershipfarm.org. By attending the webinar today, you will be eligible for 1.5 CCA continuing education units, 1 for nutrient management and 0.5 for soil and water management. You must be present for the entire webinar to receive these points. If you're watching this webinar live, you will receive an email in the next few hours with the webinar recording, a link to submit survey evaluations, and a link to our current products and services survey. A link will be provided at the end of this webinar to submit CCA credentials to earn points if you have not already done so when you initially registered. If you're watching this on demand at a later date, please be sure to watch the entire presentation through the Citrix platform and not through YouTube to receive credit. A link to register on Citrix will be provided in the text below the YouTube video recording, or it will be emailed to you if you've already registered for this webinar. You are provided instructions at the end of this presentation to submit your credentials. And now with the logistics taken care of, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks everyone for joining us today. The Partnership for Ag Resource Management is one of many projects at our nonprofit IPM Institute, each focused on using the power of the marketplace to improve sustainability. Our team of 20 is currently working to increase adoption of best practices and improve outcomes in health, environment, and economics, all key elements of sustainability. We work with pest control companies, hospitals, schools, and other facilities in communities, and with food companies and farmers around the world to improve practices and performance and to communicate those benefits to buyers and the public. Next slide, please. We write regularly on integrated pest management and other topics for Crops and Soil magazine. Our article on BT corn is one of the most recent issues. Certified crop advisors can earn 1 CEU by reading the article and taking the quiz following reading that article. Next slide. Our objectives with the Partnership for Ag Resource Management are to identify revenue opportunities for ag retailers that can help keep our valuable ag resources on cropland, help promote those products and services, and track sales through annual surveys and estimate reduction in losses of nutrients and other inputs that result from these sales. And finally, report that data back to participating ag retailers for their location, their state, and their regional averages. We work with ag retailers and industry associations to publicize these great accomplishments through press releases and articles periodically. It's very important to get this positive news out to address the misperceptions the public has about agriculture. Our current survey includes ag retail products and service that address keeping both nitrogen and phosphorus on cropland. However, we've focused on phosphorus losses to date. After this webinar, you'll receive a survey about the webinar. It will contain 2 links to 2 short products and services surveys. One survey is specific to New York challenges, so that will be just for New York ag retailers. The other survey is for the entire Great Lakes Basin, and we encourage everyone to take the survey. Please take time to contribute this worthy effort and fill them out as completely as possible, but don't spend a lot of time looking up numbers. Just use your best estimates. Most surveys that have been taken haven't taken more than 15 minutes of time. You may have also received an invite to the survey in the past few weeks via email. Next slide, please. The two photos on the right show what happens when too much phosphorus gets into the water, feeding blooms of harmful algae, which close beaches to swimming, make fishing a challenge, and have also shut down public water supplies. The graph on the left shows NOAA's annual data on algal bloom severities since 2002. After phosphorus loadings declined sharply in the mid-80s, with the advent of reduced tillage, they've increased, and as a result, we've experienced more frequent and severe algal blooms. This past year was the fourth largest bloom on record. The timing of phosphorus runoff and losses and impacts on algal blooms is highly dependent on weather. We know the phosphorus is coming primarily from agriculture because of the timing of the loads. They spike during snowmelt and rain events in winter and early spring following fall applications. Next slide, please. Ag retailers have valuable products and services which can keep inputs on cropland and out of waterways. Here's a list of some of those for phosphorus retention and use efficiency, along with some very rough average reductions based on published studies. There's lots of variability in the published numbers based on soil type, slope, proximity to surface water, and other factors, but these rough averages give us a sense of where we can likely make a difference. Cover crops, soil testing, grid or zone sampling, and variable rate custom application are revenue generating opportunities to reduce phosphorus losses. Ag retailers can also let farmers know when a broadcast application has been made so they can get out and get the application covered, worked in, or just slightly covered. Avoid application before a heavy rain event, abide by setbacks, and let farmers know when we see an issue in a field that may need attention, such as tile, blowouts, that type of thing. Applying only enough phosphorus for the following crop rather than several crops in rotation can also make a difference. Today we'll hear from experts about controlling nitrogen losses from cropland soils. It's important that everyone working with farmers understands the system and impacts on agronomic decisions. Next slide, please. Ag retailers are making a difference. For example, our annual surveys show large increases in variable rate P application in the Sandusky River watershed, increasing from 17% of acres in 2011 to 70% last year. In 2015, we secured funding for ag retailers to offer a discount on variable rate to farmers in the Sandusky River watershed who had not tried it before. We expanded to 3 additional watersheds in Northwest Ohio last year. We've had nearly 40 retailers participate and over 200 growers. Using published estimates, acres of VRT here alone represent more than 1 million pounds of phosphorus from leaving cropland in the watershed. We need to track and report the improvements we're making so that the regulators and the public are aware of these voluntary efforts, using the power of the marketplace to drive improvements. You'll hear more from Anna about some additional tools and resources we have for you to use as we work and try to achieve our goals. And Anna, with that, I'd like to turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Mark. So as Mark mentioned, we do have some free resources available on our website, partnershipfarm.org. On the left, you can see the front page of our newly updated agronomist handbook that is available free for download. And this update includes a new introduction and additional fact sheets that you can provide to growers to increase awareness of products and services that reduce the export of nutrients from cropland. And on the right, you can see the front and back of our phosphorus loss reduction wallet card, which can be ordered for free on our website as well. These serve as a great conversation starter with your growers, and many people order them to take to their various meetings. To date, we've distributed more than 25,000 wallet cards. And so Our next webinar will be on sensor-based VRT for nitrogen, and that will be held on March 7th, 2018 at the same time. And so an email to register will be sent out in the upcoming weeks. And as Mark mentioned earlier, our 2017 Great Lakes Ag Retailer Products and Services Survey is out, and a link to participate in that will be emailed with the webinar evaluation later this afternoon. We thank you in advance for your participation. And finally, we'd like to invite you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for PARM updates and industry news. You can look us up from your computer or mobile device after the webinar. So now we'll hear from Dr. Emerson Nafziger, Extension agronomist and professor of crop sciences at the University of Illinois. As I mentioned earlier, please make use of your question box during his presentation. We'll be doing his Q&A immediately after his presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Emerson.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Glad to be with you this morning. The accommodation for putting the questions and answers after I speak was so I can get on the road to Southern Illinois where I'm speaking this afternoon. So I appreciate that accommodation. This is my first experience with this organization, and I have to admit I didn't know too much about it. We've been working in nitrogen for a number of years here in Illinois and have lots of different things going on. In the background of this first slide, you see a nitrogen rate trial that was droned over and photographed this last summer. So there's about, we have something in the 45 to 50 of these going on each year in Illinois, and so we have lots of data. I wasn't quite sure what the whole scope of this was. The reason Anya contacted me to ask me to speak about this was I had given a presentation down in Louisiana this last summer on nitrogen use efficiency, and in particular whether knowing soil nitrogen, and we've been tracking that as well, will help us to improve it. So I'm going to start out today talking about the concept of nitrogen use efficiency, both as we typically do it or farmers typically do it. And I heard several farmers after this last year, we had very good yields in Illinois with just normal nitrogen rates. In fact, I'll show you some of the data, and we've been doing this long enough to kind of have an idea what to expect. But the comment gets thrown around that we were really efficient in our use of nitrogen, and the way most people talk about that is we used 200 pounds of nitrogen and got 250 bushels, so that's 0.8 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, and then I only have time to give you a little bit of flavor of some of the other things we're doing, and I'll mention soil nitrogen tracking and a few other things. I'm involved here with projects looking at tile nitrogen loss and a range of other things, so maybe someday I'll be back and talk about those, but for today, this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to use the economic optimum nitrogen rate. You'll see that term, and most of you are familiar with it, and the yield at that rate calculated from N-rate trials. And we'll, of course, show you some examples of that. But that means that people talk about the agronomic optimum and some of these kinds of things. That's not language I usually use. The economic optimum is a little bit less than the rate of nitrogen needed to maximize yield, because nitrogen, when we're putting on an input, it has to pay for itself. And so it's that point where the last bit of nitrogen is just paid for by the yield increase that it produced. And for today, we're going to use the ratio of 10 to 1. That is, 1 bushel of corn pays for 10 pounds of nitrogen. You can imagine as that ratio changes, nitrogen price or corn price go up or down, the optimum rate changes a little bit. So I've already mentioned this, but the quick and easy and popular way to calculate NUE is to divide fertilizer N rate by yield. And everybody knows that for every field they farm every year. So that one's an easy one. Now I put needed in quote marks here because when we use a certain rate in a field, we don't really know in that field how much was needed. We're happy when we get high yields, and we're happy when they come with just normal nitrogen rates, but only by having a trial, I guess, is my message here. Can we really know what the best NUE was, or the optimum rate? And the optimum rate is something we spend a lot of time talking about. We're going to call that the unadjusted NUE. And just in common practice, I think in people's minds, having that less than 1 is a goal. So we've all in the past had yield goal based nitrogen recommendations. We of course don't use those anymore. We haven't for about 15 years now. And we've switched to a nitrogen rate calculator, which we'll mention at the end. And that's based on lots of trials. So it's a tool that predicts how much nitrogen we need when we don't have any better idea than to look at previous year's data and say we think it's going to be about an average of these. One useful modification in the way that people do studies with this usually calculate NUE differently, and that is to divide the economically optimum nitrogen rate by the yield increase from using nitrogen. And some people call that delta yield, or it's the yield at the optimum nitrogen rate minus the yield without any nitrogen. And this is an important concept, and if you don't remember anything else from today, remember that the soil is a full participant in providing nitrogen to our corn crop. And if we ignore that and act like the only way crops can get nitrogen is if we put on fertilizer for them, then we're really missing the point. So we're going to call this the adjusted NUE, and it only includes the response to fertilizer N. So I'll show you some data on this and use it to illustrate the difference between these two things. Keep this in mind as well. By this definition of NUE, lower is better. In other words, the pounds of N per bushel means higher efficiency. And just to finish that thought, when we were using yield-based recommendations, in Illinois at least, the rate that was used was 1.2 pounds times the anticipated yield. And over time, that just kept not working very well, particularly in higher organic matter soils and corn following soybean. We were finding yield levels of 220 and 30 and 50, and nitrogen rates did not need to increase to the same extent that yields had increased. And so that's what got us thinking about needing a different model. I'm going to show you this as an example. This is an actual nitrogen response curve from this last year at one of our research sites. And my signal, my common use here is the yellow triangle for showing the optimum rate. So you're going to see lots of yellow triangles on the next few slides. And in this case, at 0 nitrogen, this yielded about 200 bushel. And that's, you know, in those soils, that's not highly unusual. Our average is probably 150 to 200, somewhere in that range on those kinds of soils. And you can see our typical response is rising as sort of a quadratic or curved line, and then leveling off at some point and just staying level after that. And the great majority, probably 80% of the trials we do looks something like this. And so it's a good one to keep in mind. And here's the optimum point. If you look closely, you can see it's not quite at the maximum yield, which came at about this level. And it's back here at somewhere around 130 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So when you calculate by the two ways that I described, this lower curve is the one that is what we might, it's the unadjusted one, or one that we might just call the sort of commonplace way of looking at nitrogen use efficiency. And One of the other things about NUE, the way we talk about it is, of course, the lower the nitrogen rate, the higher it is. So when we get down to, I had to put 20 in because the thing doesn't like to divide by 0. But when you get down to these levels, you can see we're getting lots of yield without much nitrogen. And since we had 200 bushel with no nitrogen, you knew that this was going to be the case. And when we got up to 250 pounds of nitrogen, which was way more than we needed, here's the optimum again. So 250 was 120 pounds more than we needed. And we see that the NUE is still less than 1 pound of nitrogen needed per bushel. When you look at the adjusted one, this one is the one now that subtracts out the yield and the nitrogen contributed by the soil, so the yield without nitrogen, and then the picture looks very different. Now you see it starts at a level that wouldn't catch anybody's attention, and it goes up, you know, from above 1 to up above 4 as we continue to put nitrogen on. Why the big difference? Because it yielded 200 bushel without nitrogen, and so the amount of yield we added with nitrogen here at the optimum nitrogen rate, or at its maximum, was only about 50 bushel. So that's just, I want to do that from a definitional standpoint. And so what does improved N efficiency mean? Efficiency is measured by how many pounds of N is required per bushel. It is not an indicator of what the best nitrogen rate is. The lower the nitrogen rate, the higher the efficiency, as I just said. And we saw by the curves we looked at that the optimum nitrogen rate in that trial was just in the middle of the range of NUE, no matter how you calculate it. So efficiency is not maximized at the optimum N rate, if we want to consider it that way. But the optimum N rate is the N rate that gives us the maximum dollar return to nitrogen. And so we can't, you know, have as a goal to lower that number, or the pounds of nitrogen needed per bushel, to the maximum extent. If we did, we'd put 10 pounds of nitrogen on every field, because we'd have, you know, big yield increase. And our first nitrogen we put on the field always gives us our largest increases. So I'm just helping you look at a different way of thinking of this maybe than you have before. So for an N rate used in a given field, high yields make for high efficiency the way we normally think of it. But we can't know for any field what the best efficiency was unless we know how much fertilizer nitrogen was needed. And only a trial can tell us that. So let's just use a group of lines, and these are actual curves. This was 2016 N response curves in on-farm trials. And so it's a little complicated here, but where the green triangle is, and we'll come back and mention the N rate calculator near the end, where these green circles is, that would have been the yield and the nitrogen rate needed according to the nitrogen rate calculator. Where the yellow triangles are for each line, that's exactly how much nitrogen was needed for optimum yield. In a very favorable year like 2016, most of those yellow triangles are actually to the left of these green circles. What that means is that the actual need for nitrogen in these fields was less than the N rate calculator told us, and what we would have used based on the N rate calculator includes previous data accumulated. So you can see some in here that are on the right hand side, and those are ones where for one reason or another we needed more nitrogen. You can also, well, we'll go on and talk about some other data, but in this case only about a fourth of the sites needed more nitrogen, and MRTN is what we use as shorthand for the maximum return to nitrogen that the N rate calculator provides. So that every year is going to be different in this regard, and in almost every case the actual optimum in one of these trials is different, either higher or lower than what the N rate calculator, because the N rate calculator number, you can see it's the same pretty much everywhere. Those are the ones in central Illinois. and they're the same everywhere because that's what the database is from. It's a very large database. This is 2015, is just by way of contrast, very wet June, and now we see most of these triangles, or the actual optimum N rates are greater than the N rate calculator would have told us. And so a wet year or a dry year in the spring, and we won't argue today whether it's loss of nitrogen or just compromised root systems. I tend to think it's more of the latter. But that's what we see when we get wet spring weather. And generally, the crop needing more nitrogen or responding to higher levels of nitrogen, even if the yield levels aren't higher. I just took the lines off and I'm showing you those yellow triangles in the form of circles here with the 2 years separate. And one thing that people look at this, and I'll just point out in passing, is that we do not see correlations between nitrogen rate needed and the yield at that rate. And people have a lot of trouble with this, figuring that it doesn't even make any sense. But remember, this is the amount of fertilizer we're using. It's not the total nitrogen supply. And we could put on, oh, I could show you probably 500 different on-farm trials over the years, and it just looks like a cloud of data points. In this case, the 2015 needed more nitrogen in general. You can see these circles over here, and 2016 needed less at very similar yield levels. So when we do the unadjusted NUE with those data that I just showed you, in the wet year of 2015, the yellow diamonds here, you can see that our NUE was, our use efficiency was lower. Remember, high number means lower efficiency, and that's simply because of the wet year. So in the drier year and better year of 2016, with really no opportunity for losing nitrogen or ruining the root system, we had higher efficiency of use on the unadjusted basis. If we look at them in the adjusted basis, you know, the numbers all go up, of course. Now we're between 1 and 3, and they kind of widen out as well. So it makes the 2 years look similar, but it's, you know, the variability is greater, so the correlations are lower. And as a general truism, what I said starting out, when we get high yields, our nitrogen use tends to look more efficient, and that should make sense to everybody by now. If you look at those 69 on-farm trials that I just showed you, this gives a pretty different picture than if you look at the unadjusted NUE. Now this is the nitrogen supplied by the soil. I'm doing it this way as a way to say, so the way we calculate this is pretty simple. In these trials, we take the yield without nitrogen, and we assume that the crop takes up 1 pound of nitrogen for each bushel of yield. Now there's floppiness in that number, and different people have different numbers to put in there, but it's in the vicinity, and it's a handy rule. So instead of mapping down here, plotting what the yield was, I just multiplied the bushels per acre times 1 to give us the pounds of nitrogen supplied by the soil. We know that, you know, that's, I think, an accurate way to look at it. We don't know what other source the crop would get its nitrogen from other than soil organic nitrogen. And when you look at it in that regard, of course, these would have higher yields. So we've had yields, I showed you one already from this last year at 200, but our yields have ranged without nitrogen from less than 50 to about 200. And that's a wide range, but not unusual. And so you can get an idea here that our higher our yields without nitrogen, the better our nitrogen use efficiency looks as well. And that makes sense. It basically says, you know, we may not even have needed very much of that nitrogen that we put on as fertilizer. So when you look at the adjusted one based on those trials, then we have the line moving in the opposite direction. And you say, well, how does that make sense? In other words, it gets less efficient the more we put on. And the real answer to that is that we're often, when we have high amounts of nitrogen provided by the soil, and we only know that when we do a zero nitrogen in a field, so we typically have no real idea of it. But when we have a lot of nitrogen provided by the soil, then the need for fertilizer nitrogen and the efficiency with which it's used are both decreased. Soil nitrogen is what we'll move on to a little bit, but the amount of N mineralized from soil organic matter is highly variable, but it can easily make up half of the nitrogen taken up by the corn crop. Potential soil N supply is generally considered to be about 2% of the soil organic nitrogen per acre per cropping season. So that's very different among different soils, from very low to, you know, we probably have some that are 4.5% organic matter in the top foot, and there we're getting up into 8,000 or 9,000 pounds of organic nitrogen per acre, and 2% of that is 160, 180 pounds of nitrogen. That's how we can get these 200 bushel yields in some cases without any fertilizer at all. Soil N has a large effect on NUE, especially the unadjusted one. The plant doesn't distinguish between fertilizer and soil supplied nitrogen, and I got ahead of myself, but here's our measure of soil supplied nitrogen, is the yield without fertilizer times 1 pound per bushel. Can soil nitrogen guide fertilizer N and improve NUE? That seems to make sense, but in practice it's kind of complicated. And my simple answer today is probably not with a great deal of confidence. Soil nitrogen levels change rapidly during vegetative growth as the crop takes up nitrogen, and the crop takes up 3 to 6 pounds of nitrogen per acre per day during vegetative growth. That means that soil supply, if there's adequate soil nitrogen there, that still means that it's dropping. And so what you'd really need to establish, if we were to be able to do variable rate or sense the nitrogen in the soil by a soil test or by a model, we would have to have confidence that finding a certain level means that then we need to add a certain amount. And that confidence, based on what we've done so far, is not very great. So the effective rooting zone, uptake zone also changes. Nitrate moves out of and into the uptake zone. Mineralization produces plant available nitrogen. Popular opinion is that soil nitrogen levels need to be high, that is 10 parts per million or 20 parts per million. As far as I can tell, there's no real backing to numbers like that, but in order to assure an adequate supply and to prevent deficiency. Well, the issue is most programs that are doing this at this point, and most of them are model-based, require setting a yield goal. I already showed you that yield doesn't have a good correlation with the amount of nitrogen needed. So starting out by saying, well, what do you want this field to yield, expect this field to yield, expect this part of the field to yield, is not always a terribly helpful question. First of all, we don't know what it's going to yield. And secondly, we also don't know what the nitrogen supply from the soil is going to be. And I made that as my second point. We don't know how much soil nitrogen at a certain growth stage is enough to keep from needing more. And I'll show you just a little bit sample of some of what we've done with soil nitrogen during vegetating. Of course, the idea of spoon feeding nitrogen has a great deal of appeal, but it involves real costs and risks related to the weather, getting it on in time, getting it into the plant on time. And at the base, you know, even though we understand it in concept, getting it to work, and I'm not talking about irrigated soils here, it works quite well in those, but that's it brings a risk and a cost if we're going to do it in our rain-fed areas. This often gives inadequate credit to the ability of the soils, and I've made that point as well, to both supply nitrogen and store it for the crop. And our desire to just make sure we have enough, you know, is still alive and well. And some people think, well, you know, if I'm going to get a good yield from this, I'm just going to have to go out and buy more nitrogen to make sure it doesn't run out. Tracking soil nitrogen, this is just an explanation of what we did. We have put it on at different times in different forms, similar or the same rate in most cases. Then we sample it from before planting to pollination time or tassel time. We take samples every couple weeks, and it's a lot of work. We take a template out so we can get the nitrogen that's in a band. Most of our applications are, and we're taking 0 to 1 and 1 to 2 feet. So we're reporting these in parts per million or pounds of nitrogen per acre, which is parts per million times 8 for 2-foot depth. And I'll just show you this as a quick example for time purposes, but this is the percent of nitrate recovered, or percent of N recovered as nitrate in our trial that last year near campus here. And this is 200 pounds with anhydrous ammonia in the fall with N-Serve, 200 pounds without N-Serve, 100 pounds in the fall plus 50 at planting plus 50 at side dress, 200 pounds of anhydrous ammonia in the spring with and without N-Serve, and then 50 at planting and 150 at side dress, and we put one in with no nitrogen. Now this is not amount, this is percent of what we recover that's in the nitrate form. And nitrate, as most of you know, is the form that's losable in the soil. So we'd like to delay the formation of nitrate. When we put fall nitrogen on, we've done this enough now to see this as pretty routine, that it's up in that roughly 80% range, and you can see a slightly higher amount here, percentage, where we did not have N-Serve in the fall, and we would kind of expect that. N-Serve is supposed to delay the nitrification process. When we put it on in the spring as anhydrous, then you can see it's much more ammonium. What's not nitrate is ammonium, of course, and then it rises slowly. The point, though, is nitrogen uptake begins at about this point in time, the end of May, first part of June, when it starts to get serious, when the corn plants have reached a foot tall or a little taller. And at that point, after that, you know, most forms are mostly nitrate no matter how we put them on. The only one that's an exception here is the 50 pounds at planting and 150 at side dress. This would have been put on as side dress in late May. And so because we're using UAN solution, we're putting on some ammonium. This is the amounts then from those treatments. And as this was from 2016, and as you can see, you know, these kind of crashed to earth during the uptake period. So the question we were trying to figure out is whether any low amounts that we have here translate into lower yields. And generally, we have found not very well. This is the 2017 data. And you can see here we had serious rainfall in late April, early May after this and before this. And these numbers were not as high, and they started down, and they were not as high during vegetative development. But we still did not really see a yield reduction from this. These are the yields from that, statistically separated. We had a 100-pound rate and a 0. You can see here when we had 200 pounds put on, the rates were not really very different from one another. Interestingly enough, the 50 at planting and 150 at side dress tends to have a high amount of nitrogen there late in June, early July, but tends in some cases not to yield as well. This is another site we did this. You can see levels again bounced around but showed that decline, and we did not see really any effect of timing, except the 50 plus 150 in this case did not yield as well as 200 put on in these other times. So this is a really preliminary and quick look at this, but when we looked at some of these data over sites, this is the soil nitrogen in the top 2 feet in mid-June, and then this was the yield, final yield of these. And you can see as long as it was above about 100 parts per million, that would be about 10 parts per million of nitrate. In the top 2 feet, we had enough. This is an exception. This was at our Monmouth site. The yield was compromised, but the nitrogen in the soil was never low. And so we have some more pondering to do. And this is at tassel time. The previous slide was from mid-June. And when we get to tassel time, the amount of nitrogen we need to maximize yield drops even further and is now down at only 5 or 6 parts per million of nitrate. So I'm just saying that in words there. You know, at mid-vegetative stages, about 16 parts per million nitrate in the top 2 feet was more than enough to maximize yield. This dropped to less than 10 parts per million nitrate by tassel time. But you know, these don't give us confidence that the numbers can predict anytime we would take these during vegetative growth, that they would predict what the yield response is going to be or the need for more nitrogen. And I just say that here in word as well. You know, priming, having adequate soil and available prior to certain growth stages may be more critical than the amount during that stage or after that stage. So single points in time, I'm not sure are going to get us very far. Late season nitrogen stress, this idea that the crop will run out of nitrogen almost never actually happens. If it's got good color at pollination time, generally the lack of nitrogen or firing that we see late in the season is not a lack of soil nitrogen, it's a lack of water to bring it into the roots and lack of water for the plant to function. And it's really a physiological response of the plant to losing its ability to photosynthesize, and that's all dependent on water in almost every case. And our nitrogen timing work is showing that delaying some of the nitrogen is not very likely to increase yields. So I'll just show you a few to finish up. Then this is another timing study. We've done a number of these on farm. This is just an example from this last year. Fall anhydrous is this line, spring anhydrous. So fall versus spring is not showing as much difference as we expected. The optimum nitrogen needed for fall application is a little bit higher typically than for spring application, but the yield differences are fairly small. That's just an example. We have in some of our trials a comparison of putting all the nitrogen on at planting, this line versus 50 at planting plus broadcast plus side dressing, the rest. And you can see here that putting it all on at planting has been a little bit superior to splitting it with 50 on at planting. And the broadcast might be one complication there. We're trying to simulate what we're doing with so-called weed and feed or putting on herbicide with UAN, and it's possible we might have lost some of that. But in general, we have not seen splitting or delaying nitrogen to giving us a boost in yield or an increase in use efficiency by lowering the amount of N needed. This is an example of a trial that we've done where what I call late split here has the nitrogen rate at planting put on at 50 pounds less than this rate shows, and then we come back at pollination time or tassel time and dribble 50 pounds of nitrogen as UAN along the base of the plants, similar to what the Y drop does for those of you familiar with that. This is very common that we're seeing very little difference between these two yield responses. So just bring us to an end here, the on-farm trials from this last year. This isn't all of them, but it's most of them. And we see again this wide distribution of crops, and about a third of our sites this year needed more nitrogen than this MRTN or the green circle rate. If we had somehow known what the optimum was for each field and used that, over all these sites, we would have used 5 pounds less nitrogen and yielded 3 bushel per acre more. So it's gives us confidence that the N rate calculator, you know, is pretty good in general, and that's what it's designed to be based on previous data. And if you run it today in your state, if you participate in it, you'll get an output like this. This says for Central Illinois, 245 sites. Suggests a maximum return to nitrogen coming at a rate of 172 pounds per acre, corn following soybean. And that's the chart for us in Illinois, Lake Springfield watershed, we have a small separate one there. This is the rate at 35-cent nitrogen and $3.50 corn. And this is the number in the parentheses is the number of trials that goes into each one of these. So this is our last slide, and thank you very much for your attention. This is one of my favorite slides. I took this picture on June the 9th, 2016. We had a very good start to the year, and on this side, these 4 rows had no nitrogen applied. These 4 rows had 200 pounds of nitrogen applied. And that's what they looked like. This one yielded 139 bushels per acre, and this one yielded 234. So I'm not going to throw water on your next webinar, which is going to be talking about sensing color, but we're in soils that can provide a lot of nitrogen if conditions are right to the growing crop. That's going to always present a challenge. So I'll stop with that, and went slightly over my time, and there may not be time for questions, but do you have any?
Yeah, thanks. Let's just do one quick question. So I have one that says, since soybeans are a legume and fix nitrogen, how much of this soil nitrogen is due to the soil nitrogen versus how much is based on the breakdown of the remaining soybean stubble?
The answer is soybeans are not the benign crop, leaving a great gift of nitrogen behind for the corn crop. That's an understanding that makes some sense. Corn following soybean needs less nitrogen than corn following corn, but we think it's mostly a corn penalty rather than a soybean benefit. And so soybean actually, by all measures, takes up more nitrogen from the soil. In other words, if you measure soil nitrogen at the beginning of the season, at the end of the season, it's usually less with soybeans. Remember that they take it up late in the season, and the residue does not have enough in to make up that difference. So it's a good question. Soybean, we've given up the idea of a soybean N credit and warn people if they use the nitrogen rate calculator. Our corn after soybean, corn after corn numbers are derived from trials done with those previous crops, and we should not be doing any adding or subtracting to those rates that we give.
Okay, great, thank you. Sorry, we only have time for one question.
No problem.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Emerson. So next. Next, we will hear from Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins. Elizabeth is a field specialist in agronomic systems with Ohio State University Extension. So.
Good morning. Thank you guys for having me. Thank you, Anna. We've got a couple minutes here, so I'll try to get through this as quickly as I can. I'm going to piggyback off of a lot of what Emerson talked about. Here at Ohio State, the Precision Ag team and myself are working to look at ways to come up with a strategy to really optimize our nitrogen application when the opportunity comes around. So Emerson talked a lot about nitrogen efficiency, nitrogen use efficiency, and I really believe part of the key behind this when the rubber meets the road and we're trying to apply this science to the field is making sure that nitrogen is in the soil and available when the crop is ready to take it up. With some of our hybrids today, this graph here shows the nitrogen curve that we see in uptake. So when we talk about our traditional nitrogen application windows, here at least in Ohio, we see a lot of guys will put that nitrogen on up front as a starter and then perhaps come back through with a side dress application around V6. And one of the challenges we see there is when we're applying our nitrogen this early in the season, as you can see on this uptake curve, the need of the crop really isn't there yet. So the time between when we put that nitrogen out and when the crop is going to take it up, and that corn crop is really going to start demanding nitrogen after V10, that window is pretty wide, and we're really risking either loss or something happening in between to that nitrogen that can decrease the efficiency. So some of those things that can occur when we get a nice hot spring, lots of GDUs, but that sun is going to help volatilize. It's going to activate those microbes in the soil, and that nitrogen is going to volatilize and be lost to the atmosphere. Another scenario, we saw this a lot last season, is we get just a real rainy spring, and on the flip side, what we see is denitrification and leaching. So that's another avenue that we can lose nitrogen through. When we're talking about efficiency and these things that are going on in the soil, though, it's not all bad news, because every once in a while we get one of those great years where we get a nice rain and then it warms up and the soil dries out. We get another well-timed rain, and then again the soil, it warms up and the soil dries out. And what that does is it breaks up the population of those microbes, and they cause mineralization. They release nitrogen that becomes available to our crop. So it can give us a credit that we don't necessarily, we can take advantage of that. The other side of the coin, when we talk about nitrogen efficiency, is how well can that crop take up and utilize the nitrogen. And so there are things that can happen in season that can decrease our nitrogen use efficiency on the yield side. So we can have a reduction in stand due to a pest. This is actually a picture from one of our nitrogen plots this spring. It was rainfall after rainfall. It seemed like we couldn't get anything less than 3 inches. And so the flooding became an issue, and not only reduced our nitrogen in the soil, but also decreased our yield potential in that corn crop. And then here in Ohio, it's not terribly uncommon for us to get some hurricane winds that make it up here in the late summer and early fall that can really do some damage. And so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I think Emerson covered this pretty well. But we see a lot of variation between seasons in what our nitrogen needs are. So for example, here's 2015, and this is data from a nitrogen timing trial. And the 2 timings that I wanted to point out to you here are the difference between applying that nitrogen at planting and the difference when we came in and made a late season V15 application. And in 2015, I'll show you a graph in a second, but what we saw was that if we made that late season application, even with less total nitrogen applied, we were able to achieve the same yield. And the reason we saw that, if we think back to 2015, was here we had an uncharacteristically wet June. And so with over 8 inches of rain in June, Emerson says it's probably due to the roots being stunted or potentially some of the leaching of that nitrogen. But this green line here shows that crop uptake curve. And either way, what we saw was that heavy rain event took place before the crop was able to begin utilizing that nitrogen heavily. And so there was that risk was assumed, and we weren't able to take advantage of the commercial nitrogen that we applied. Another year, 2016, what we saw with, this is a nitrogen rate trial. So we had 4 different rates ranging from 100 to 250 pounds of nitrogen. And what we saw in 2016 was that regardless of how much nitrogen we applied, we only achieved an average of about 215 bushels per acre. And so what we saw there, again, this is that same weather graph, was our precipitation fell several inches below trend in 2015 for, 3 months of the year. And so what we saw here was a decrease in our yield potential that wasn't caused by nitrogen in any sort of form. So then we begin to think about, when we see years like this, how can we reduce that risk and maximize our opportunity? And so now with the equipment that we have available to us, such as Y-drops, there's the ability to press that nitrogen application perhaps back till mid-season or even late season. And the way we classify those as a mid-season application would be anything from about V6 up to V9 or 10, and late season is anything that you apply after V10. So then if we have this capability to get into the field later, the question becomes, so when and how are we able to know what the season is going to give us? So we wait till Mother Nature, or Maverick in this case, is going to show us the cards so we know perhaps how to make a better decision on our nitrogen application. So in order to try to track this through our research, we're looking at several things. The first is what nitrogen is available. And we've tried to estimate that through tissue sampling, NDVI, so normalized difference vegetative index, and we've used for that both aerial imagery and a handheld green seeker. And then as Emerson was referring to those available nitrogen tests, we've also done those 12-inch cores. We've also tried to keep track of how the season is progressing in terms of yield potential. So early in the season, we evaluate stand, we look at uniformity and vigor. I discuss with the cooperating grower what the genetic potential is. We look at historical information about the field. And then this year, one of our biggest challenges was planting date and what windows we had available. So the way this trial is laid out is we have 6 different treatments, and it's split through 3 different timings. So our first timing where we apply nitrogen is at the time of planting. We apply nitrogen again at V5, V6, so traditional side dress, and then we have a late season application. So now I want to show you just some data of an example of how we walked through this decision trial at one of our locations this past summer. And this was located in Fayette County, Ohio, which is in the southwest portion of the state. So at the beginning of the season, we looked at that historical field data and determined over time 180 pounds per acre is a good nitrogen rate for both our yield goal and that field potential. And so for those 3 treatments at planting, we applied either 0 or 180, and then all of the rest of the plots got a base rate of 100 pounds per acre to get us until the next application. So this is what it looked like for our application at planting. So then at each time point, we looked at the weather information that we had available to us, and I think this is probably pretty similar, our 2017 was, to what you guys had. We were really wet up front in the season, but once May and June started to unfold, it was looking like it was going to be a great summer. Our soil and tissue tests were giving us some really good insight. We pulled these samples on June 23rd, so just a little over a month after planting. And what we were seeing here in our soil test was we're getting pretty good, this is in pounds per acre, so we're getting pretty good mineralization rates. We're seeing, there hasn't been a lot of uptake that we're seeing, but at the same time, where we had no nitrogen, we're seeing about 50 pounds per acre, which is exceeding our expectations. On these tissue tests, what we saw, if the sufficiency at V5 is about 4%, and so even on our plots that had 0 nitrogen, we're well above the sufficiency range. We're not seeing any sort of deficiency in that crop to date. So here's some quick pictures. This photo was taken on June 1st, and then we collected NDVI imagery a few days before sampling, and you can see there's some variation in the field. Interestingly, or not, depending on how you look at it, those zones where we're seeing deficiency in the NDVI imagery lined up not with any of our treatments, but with our soil type maps. So at that point in time, we made the decision that, well, first we carried through that 180 pounds at all 3 time points in order to determine if there was a penalty for waiting to apply nitrogen. And then that second plot was what our decision plot was. So at this point in time, we determined that we had no change in our yield goal. Things were going really well. Yes, we were seeing good mineralization, but not enough that we felt comfortable pulling back on our nitrogen rate. So we went ahead with 180 pounds per acre at that point in time. So we repeated this whole system again several weeks later once we hit V10. And so we're still getting good moisture moving into July. That's a little bit above average for us at almost 6 inches of rainfall. So on the V10, what we see here, our soil nitrogen available is actually starting to drop off, and that could be a combination of a reduction in mineralization, but probably more likely we're starting to see that plant uptake ramp up. And for the first time in the season in this tissue test, we saw a slight deficiency. At V10, we're now pulling a leaf sample. The sufficiency is 3.5%. So at the 0 rate check plot, we're seeing a slight deficiency at July 7th, but just barely below that threshold. So at this point in time, we felt like things were going pretty well. We felt like there was a good bit of nitrogen out there. We were seeing the bulk of the uptake. So we kept that 180 check plot. We decided we would be bold, and we cut back our other nitrogen application down to just 30 pounds. So that application was made at VT, and it totaled up to 130 pounds. So here's just some quick pictures. July 20th was the day that we made that application. We used the NutriBoss system to go through, and you can tell in the picture on the right that even though that crop had only received 100 pounds of nitrogen up until that point, it was still looking pretty healthy, no deficiency symptoms. So this was not quite a month later. We had a field day, and we were able to fly a nice little aerial capture of what the field looked like. And what I'd like to point out here is that we're really only seeing those the zero nitrogen check strips. So not a lot of deficiency going on, definitely no strips even where we only applied 130, which this outside pass would have been a 130, and yeah, I can't even recall on the other reps what it was, and I can't see them. So everything looked pretty good up to that point. So this is some of our yield information, and so I want to walk you through because it's a lot of numbers in your face right now. Each one of these at the first time point, this was at planting where we applied both 0 and 180. What we saw is what we expect. I do not recommend not applying any nitrogen at all. At the second time point, both of those applications were 180 pounds. As we would expect, we achieved the same yield. We did not see a significant difference in yield between the at planting 180 and that side dress application of 180. What we did see, however, in the late season was a very slight decrease with that 130. It was significantly different, about 15 bushels. But with that offset of 50 pounds, it nearly made up for it economically. So we do see, it's not even in that 180, we do see a slight drop off, although it's not statistically significant from the others, but it is getting close. And so the reason that we think that that late season application was a little less effective is because of this weather situation. So right after we made that application, July 20th, and immediately after that, the rain shut off. So we were a little below trend there in late summer, and I think that limited our nitrogen uptake and the efficiency of that late season application. So what we learned to wrap up is that the nitrogen availability changes really quickly in season. I think that, I second that Emerson was speaking to. We don't have a great way of tracking the availability in the soil. Soil samples, well, they can be accurate if pulled correctly. They're very labor intensive, and at this point, by the time you get those results back from the lab, it's likely that your soil availability is completely different. This year, we thought going into this that I was working with, we have a climatologist here in Extension. We were hoping that we could get some accurate weather forecasts a couple weeks out to help us determine how effective these applications were going to be. But of course, I'm sure you guys are familiar, the weather pattern was in a neutral pattern all summer, and so anybody I talked to said that they had a 50-50 chance of going either way. which isn't very helpful. So anytime we don't have those accurate weather forecasts, it's going to be incredibly difficult to hit that optimum. I think that goes really without saying. And it really didn't show at this location. We had another location where we were a little bit more ambitious and only used about half of the rate up front, so 45 pounds of nitrogen to start off with. And we did see with that late season application that with only 45 pounds and waiting 2 months to make another application, there was a yield penalty there. So making sure that you have a sufficient base rate to get you to that late season application, or going with a 3-pass strategy, is going to be really important. So I went through that pretty quickly. If you are interested in the research that we're doing here at Ohio State, this is a link to our 2017 research report. Go ahead and check that out. If you want to learn more about what we're doing throughout the year, you can follow us on Twitter or on Facebook. And that's our handle. And with that, does anyone have any questions?
Let's see. Yeah, everyone, please enter your questions in the question box right now. And in the meantime, I'd like to thank Elizabeth and Emerson for presenting. So I have one to get us started. So have you seen any nitrogen stabilizers that are standouts among the many out there? Is there any in-field or side-by-side testing that you're aware of?
Personally, through my research and the research here in Ohio that I'm familiar with, I have not seen a big benefit to a nitrogen stabilizer, but climate-wise, we're pretty different than the rest of the Corn Belt. So I think it depends a lot on how much moisture you get in season as to how effective that's going to be for you. Here we get enough moisture that those nitrogen stabilizers are broken down fairly quickly. If you're in a slightly more drier region, you're going to see a bigger benefit with those nitrogen stabilizers.
Okay, we have another question. So what % of organic matter is in the field in Fayette County?
This field that we're working with is predominantly Brookston and Crosby soils. So they're poorly drained. I would have to look to specifically tell you what the organic matter % is, but I want to say that they're relatively low, probably around 1%.
Okay. So we have one. Does Y drop placement location minimize the lack of rain nitrogen losses?
That's hard to speak to. We do have a nitrogen placement trial that we've been conducting here for the last 3 years, where we're looking at, in those late season applications, the Y drop where it puts it in the row, a coulter application down the middle, and then also dribbling the nitrogen down the middle of the row. We don't see a yield benefit between the coulters and the Y drops. There is a yield penalty for dribbling it down the middle of the row, which we're still digging into that data. It seems like the key to that is if you can get it in with a coulter, I think that's probably a good option, but there's no benefit to that over Y drops. But with Y drops, I mean, theoretically, they say if you get it in to the row, there's more moisture there and it's going to be drawn down quicker. I mean, intuitively, that makes sense. I haven't seen any data that says that doesn't work.
Okay. So would you expect the V6 split application to be better than all upfront application in some years?
I mean, it depends on the year. I think that yes, in some years if you found the right situation, there's going to be a benefit to that V6 application. And there's really, in practice, there's a shorter window than you realize between V6 and V10. Once we got into late summer with those late planting dates, it was about 10 days apart. So I think if you get a a very heavy rain situation in early spring, you could see a benefit with that V6.
Okay, so somebody asked, what type of liquid nitrogen are you using and how long does it take to become available to the crop?
All the nitrogen source for this particular study was 28%. So it's available.
Okay, and I think we might have time for 2 more questions maybe. So how do you see a farmer implementing a nitrogen decision trial on their farm? Would one trial across their whole farm be adequate?
So right now, all of these trials are conducted on farm. So that actually provides a unique opportunity to work with these farmers and try to develop the thought process, because it's definitely different than what they're used to doing. For us, we went out and found guys who were willing to try something new, and we're lucky enough we have the equipment to go out and help them demo this on their farm. I found that they're really open to trying it, and I think the best part of these trials and working with farmers is at the end of the season, they're really excited to dig into the data and talk about what they learned and what we can do differently next year. So I think that the interest is there to figure out how to make some of this technology work.
Okay, great. And so I guess the last question, why did you choose 100 pounds at planting versus a lower amount?
A lot of that was how comfortable the individual farmer was. We sat down in February or March, depending on the location and the grower, and we discussed how low they were willing to go. So my more risk-taking farmers went lower. 100 pounds was our highest upfront rate, but really it's their comfort level. And I think with 45, that guy's going to come up next year, and I think we've talked the 100-pound guys into going down next year, just to try to find for each what's the right amount is probably going to differ by field and likely differ by year. But if we can narrow in on that, I mean that's what we're aiming for with this research.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, in the interest of time, I'd like to wrap up the Q&A. I really want to thank Elizabeth and Emerson for joining us today. We really appreciate the time that they spent to share their work. So thank you. So at this time, I want to recognize our participating ag retailers. If you're an ag retailer in the Great Lakes Basin that's interested in participating in this partnership to benefit your business and water quality, please contact our outreach coordinator, Caitlin Leahy, at caitlin@partnershipfarm.org. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge our funders and collaborators that made this webinar possible. In particular, the support of the Great Lakes Protection Fund and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. As we wrap up, please remember to look for the email later this afternoon with a webinar evaluation, a webinar recording, and a link to submit your CCA credentials, only if you've not done so in registration, so that you can earn the 1.5 CCA CEUs. And the email will also contain a link to our 2017 Products and Services Survey, so please take that as well. So I want to thank you all again for joining us today, and I hope you will join us again for our next webinar in March. So thank you.